Welcome to your last set of lecture slides for the semester. Nice work kind of staying engaged as we've gone through this weird transition to online. Just a note, I don't have my headset for this lecture, so if you hear my dog in the background, I'm sorry about that. All right, so let's go ahead and just quickly review kind of energy transformations in cellular respiration, and then we'll dive into our final topic of photosynthesis. I'm combining here a graph that you might be familiar with from Unit 3 with the new steps of cellular respiration that you've learned about so far in Unit 4. And so on the y-axis here, you should recognize free energy as kind of the energy available in the system to cause change. And I've color-coded here that our reactants for cellular respiration are in blue, our products are in pink, and then anything that's sort of an energy input or output is going to be in orange here. So in cellular respiration, you've got glucose as one of the main reactants, and it's going to react with oxygen in the presence of oxygen to produce carbon dioxide and water. And that kind of takes care of our matter in this reaction. And you can see that whole reaction down here on the bottom. But our main output, kind of what the cell is benefiting from in terms of the overall reaction, is the production of ATP here, which you can then use to power cellular work. And remember that cellular respiration occurs in 3 steps. It starts with glycolysis in the cytosol of the cell, and then the Krebs cycle in the mitochondrial matrix, and finally the electron transport chain, which is happening in the proteins that are embedded in the inner mitochondrial membrane. So not all the way in the matrix, not outside the mitochondria, but the membrane between the outer membrane of the mitochondria and the matrix itself. All right, I want to add to this graph here the process of photosynthesis, and have a look at the bottom of the slide here to see how that reaction changed, or I guess did not change in this case. So just kind of a point of clarification here, if we run the reaction in this direction, we are looking at cellular respiration, and I'll just abbreviate that CR. And if we run the reaction in this direction, we're looking at photosynthesis. And so as you learned at the start of this unit, the reactants of one are the products of the other. The products of one are the reactants of the other. So in cellular respiration, if we consume glucose and oxygen to produce CO2 and H2O with a little bit of energy, in photosynthesis, we are going to use CO2 and H2O and a little bit of energy to produce glucose and oxygen. If we want to put that back in the context of our free energy up here on the y-axis, you can kind of see how if glucose is used in cellular respiration and produced in photosynthesis, it's going to sit up here as kind of our high potential energy molecule in both cases. And whereas our cellular respiration reaction is exergonic in releasing energy, exergonic, our photosynthesis reaction is endergonic and requires energy. And the energy that's required is coming from sunlight. And so just like with cellular respiration, we've got the same matter that we're working with here, water, carbon dioxide, oxygen, and glucose. The only big change here is the type of energy. In cellular respiration, we're producing mostly ATP here, and in photosynthesis, we are kind of relying on the sunlight to power this endergonic process, this anabolic process, building a big molecule from small reactants. And you'll probably be happy to hear that in photosynthesis, we only need to worry about 2 reactions. There are the light reactions and the Calvin cycle, also known as the dark reactions or light independent reactions. In photosynthesis, it's basically the opposite electron flow compared to cellular respiration. And so if you want to think about oxidation and reduction, like back from what we were talking about in our lecture last week, then you can also just follow that rule, follow the hydrogens here as well. So if you want to think about Leo the lion says grr, lose electrons is oxidation, gain electrons is reduction. Then in this case, carbon dioxide here is going to become reduced over the course of photosynthesis, and gain electrons reduce, or follow the hydrogens, gain hydrogens reduction. And so carbon dioxide is reduced over the course of photosynthesis, whereas water is going to be oxidized. Leo, lose electrons, oxidized, or lose hydrogen, oxidized. And so if we start with CO2 and we end with C6H12O6, we've reduced. We start with H2O and we end with just O2, then we become oxidized in that process. And like we mentioned in the previous slide, this is an endergonic process that requires energy in the form of sunlight. And in eukaryotes, it's going to happen in an organelle called the chloroplast. So what does a chloroplast look like? The chloroplast is similar to the mitochondria in that it has a double membrane. So we've got a phospholipid bilayer out here and a phospholipid bilayer in here. And then inside the chloroplast itself, we have this kind of fluid-filled space that we call the stroma. And there are lots of there is lots of terminology around the different structures within the chloroplast itself. You definitely want to remember this one. You want to remember the stroma because one of our reactions, the Calvin cycle, happens there. And then the other thing that you definitely want to be aware of are these thylakoids. Thylakoids are these individual kind of disc-shaped structures that exist in stacks inside of the chloroplast, and they are also surrounded by a phospholipid membrane. And in that membrane are lots of proteins that are embedded that facilitate the light reactions of photosynthesis. And so our first part of the photosynthetic reaction is happening here, and I'll put a number 1, and the second part is happening here. All right, so we'll end this little intro lecture on the chloroplast itself, and meet me in the next slide to talk about the details of the light reactions.